Hello, I'm Jess, and I'm going to take a slightly different turn here when we're looking at the impact that humans have. We're primarily going to focus on invasive species. So we've looked a lot at climate change and also through Ryan, like how we're influencing the direct environment around us. But one of the other big impacts that we're having is how we move species around. So I'm a polar ecologist and I specialize in Antarctica. And hopefully I'm going to convince you this is a really, really great place to look at those influences that we're having as human beings. So today, in association with the British Ecological Society, the University of Birmingham, and also the British Antarctic Survey where I work, I present to you When Aliens Attack Antarctica. There we go. So Antarctica is the largest wilderness on Earth. It is isolated and it is extreme, and because of this, it's also the least invaded continent on the Earth. And this is for several reasons. So here you can see that it's physically distanced from its surrounding continents, 360 degrees surrounded by ocean. We have a swirling vortex of winds from the southern circumpolar vortex. This keeps it cool. It keeps it cut off from the rest of the world effectively, stops those warm airs moving down from the tropics. And we can see here that this cuts it off from the ozone, so the ozone is able to pool right above the Antarctic continent, forming the ozone hole that you heard of. And it also keeps it cut off from those areas that are bringing warm temperature down and keeps it cold and extreme. Those winds will also buffer it from any migration, so you're only going to get the strongest of birds able to fly down there. And in the oceans, we have something similar happening with the Antarctic circumpolar current. This is a really, really strong current that stops any of that cold nutrient water from around the Antarctic Peninsula and Antarctic continent from moving upwards, and likewise, any warm oceans moving downwards. So we have an oceanic barrier and also a barrier in the atmosphere as well that keeps it isolated and keeps it cold. So, it's a good question. Where do these aliens come from? If it's such a hard place to get to, how on earth are they getting there? This is how they're getting there. They're getting there from us. Most of the alien species that arrive in Antarctica are coming from us. We have had over a century of exploration in Antarctica, and there's an acceptable increase in the rise of tourism. Just last year, 50,000 people visited Antarctica, and that's 10 times as many scientists that visit there. So it's just 5,000 scientists compared to 50,000 tourists. And a study in 2012, which was a really smart study, they vacuumed everybody's clothes as they were getting off ships all around Antarctica, clothes and wedding dresses and tuxedos, I'm guessing, as well. And they found that these people were covered in seeds. And I guarantee that if we vacuumed any of you today, any of your coats, any of your trousers, we'd find seeds on you as well. In fact, if we raise the lights up a little bit, I don't know if we can do that from someone at the back, but if you take a look at your shoes right now, I guarantee that you're going to have dirt on your shoes. And in that dirt, there's going to be soil, there's going to be microorganisms, there can even be like seeds and soil organisms as well. And the reason that this is important is because in Antarctica, a tablespoon of soil will contain very, very few organisms. You won't have very much fungi or bacteria, let alone seeds or soil animals. Whereas if you take that same spoonful of soil from your own back garden, you'll have as many microorganisms as there are people on the planet. So moving these trace examples of seeds and dirt around can have a big effect in an ecosystem that isn't trained to have these things in them normally. But that's not to say that tourists are the only ones to blame. So this map here is all of the stations and research bases that we have in Antarctica as scientists. The yellow are the year-round stations, open both summer and winter, and then we have the summer-only stations as well. Compared to where the tourists are going, and they tend to be going directly straight to the Antarctic Peninsula and the surrounding islands. And this matters because where we're visiting the most, around the edges and on the peninsula, are the areas that are warming the fastest. The Antarctic Peninsula is the fastest warming place on the planet. And you probably know about the collapse of the ice shelves. We lost Larsen A in 95, B 2002, and just last year a huge chunk came off of Larsen C. And if we look at how human visitation is increasing as well, we can start to get an idea of how our movement combined with climate change is going to be driving an increase in new species to this area. So the darker the colors in these areas, the higher the risk. And most of this is focused on the Antarctic Peninsula. Well, Barbara, if you had to choose from all of these things that are on here, Who would you say had been introduced to Antarctica and the subantarctic islands? Cats, reindeer, rats, flies, grass, all of them have been introduced over the last century in one way or another. So we have the Antarctic islands, which are generally quite cold, but then we have milder and wetter, warmer summers where vertebrates can survive. And over the years, everything has been included, from cats and rabbits, and then in the oceans we see crabs and bivalves like scallops as well. But more often than not, it's the insects and the plants that we're introducing to these areas. And that's because those are the ones that we tend to miss the easiest. So you'll have found on your, well, I would have given you as you came through the door some postcards, letters home from invasive species that are the most tenacious, the ones that are hanging on in there. Despite these harsh conditions, they've managed to make themselves a home. So keep hold of these cards, because they'll also act as a bit of a raffle ticket, because British Antarctic Survey gave me a ton of giveaways and goodies and things like that, so keep a hold of them. But by far the most influential of all of these invasive species on this page, would anyone like to have a guess? Nice. Barbara. We are the most influential invasive species, and we can't forget that. We're not separate from this. We're carriers of invasive species, and we are an invasive species ourselves. In fact, over the last 13 years, the Australian Antarctic Division have been doing a survey about the impact that we're having, and found that we've carried 1,376 invertebrates to Antarctica unwittingly in cargo, food packaging, all kinds of things. And this is a really diverse range of insects as well. We've got ladybirds, spiders, not an insect, and all kinds of things going down there. Although many individuals, they wouldn't survive if we let them out of the boxes, just because it's such a tough environment. However, we're getting so cosmopolitan in our distribution ourselves that we're taking things along with us that themselves are cosmopolitan. And this is Trichothera maculapennis, rhymes with Dennis. And it was introduced to King George Island, just off the Antarctic Peninsula, in cargo from Uruguay in 2007. And it's taken up residence there in the sewage system. It's got a charming lifestyle. And since it's spread to not only the Uruguayan research base, but it's also taken up residence in the Polish base, the Chilean base, the Korean base. And it's all because of the infrastructure that's already there that allows it to exist in this way, but also because it's a cosmopolitan species already. So this gnat you find up as high in the Arctic, it's already adapted to this really cold environment. So going to the same latitude down south, there's no stress for it. It can still happily fly around and do just as well. So over the years, this is how many species we've managed to introduce to both the subantarctic and the maritime Antarctic. So when I say subantarctic, I mean the areas that's kind of in that big Antarctic circumpolar current, just the islands that are scattered around the Antarctic continent. The maritime Antarctic, this is the peninsula and those areas around the edges where I showed you earlier, where we're going the most, and areas that are warming the most. So because the subantarctic is a little less harsh, it's a lot easier for things to establish there. But we can learn lessons from this because, as we've already seen, the Antarctic Peninsula is warming up. And we can only predict that things are going to start looking more like this in the maritime Antarctic over the next century. But so far, we've introduced 108 different plant species, 72 invertebrates, and 16 vertebrates. And these aren't just passers-by. These guys have established and they have lived there. In the maritime Antarctic, 2 species of plant and 9 species of invertebrate. Vertebrates tend not to survive so well on the Antarctic continent, but we do take them there on our tours, effectively. So back in the age of exploration, we would take dogs and horses to pull our sleds, and we'd even take cats for company, and also to look after mice and things on ships, but mostly for company. This is Mrs. Chippy, and she's with the cook here on the Shackleton expedition, and she would frequently come off the ship and walk around on the ice, harass the dogs, and she was very, very happy, and she's not the only cat who's been to Antarctica. The research base that I went to in Antarctica had a cat there until the 1970s, but she's a little ecosystem on her own, so goodness knows what else she might have dropped off along the way. And this is one of the mules that went out to go and rescue Captain Scott expedition. A bit ill-fated, so she just brought him back, kind of against his will, but I can guarantee you this is the only time that a mule and a penguin have stood face to face. these animals were just passing through. They can't survive in the Antarctic continent. But like I said, out in those mild islands, places that we can learn lessons from, these animals and mammals can survive. Not only can they survive, but they can thrive. And so that lets me talk to you a bit about rats. Gasp. That's a little bit better. See, she agrees. It's my dashing Photoshop skills there. The rats infested this beautiful island of South Georgia, a sub-Antarctic island. We introduced them kind of accidentally. They came on the ships with the whalers and during the heyday of the Antarctic explorers when they stopped off here. And they found it habitable enough, and they started to spread. And then over the years, they started to have a really big impact on these beautiful birds and many other seabirds that take up residence in the South Georgia islands. They were eating their chicks, they were eating their eggs, and combined with all of the other pressures that these birds are facing, we started to see a massive decline. And we needed to take it upon ourselves to take responsibility for the introduction that we had made that started this decline. So in 2009, researchers began a cull. And this became the world's largest extermination exercise, and it was successful. Just very recently, they've managed to clear the entire island, 160 kilometers long, of rats. But rats are not the villain of this piece. It's our complacency and our lack of understanding of how ecosystems work that led to the introduction and led to the demise of some of these birds. Some of them were almost wiped out. So it's important to remember that sometimes it's not always the things that are the most visible that are the problems. We need to look out to ourselves a little bit more and learn from these experiences. And what we are learning is that it's not necessarily the things that are the most visible that are having the most impact, especially in ecosystems that are as basic as the Antarctic. Sometimes it's things like this guy that are a little bit more worrisome. I'm hoping I can get him to jump. Oh, no, he won't. You have to believe me. This is a springtail. So springtails, also known as collembola, you probably find them in your compost at home. They can look little tiny white things around here, but there's a huge range of them. They're very diverse. And out of 9 of the insect species that have been introduced to the Antarctic proper, 6 of them are these guys. And they might be tiny, but they're numerous, and soil-dwelling insects, they really, really matter, because these guys are ecosystem engineers, and moreover, they are tough. So whilst it's only warmer, milder places that the mammals can live, the things that we think of as being big impactors, these can kind of sneak in under the radar and survive in places on the Antarctic continent that we couldn't even consider living in. So, yes, how do they survive? It's a very good question, my lovely prompts. So Antarctica is cold and it's dry in the absolute extreme. So when I say that, I mean that Antarctica in some places can be almost minus 90 degrees Celsius. So the Antarctic Peninsula has an average temperature about the same as your freezer, and that's the warm bit. But these animals still survive there. So how are they doing it? So this animal at the top, this dashing beast that's caught in the throes of a romance by some intruding photographer here. This is the female. She's a cracking specimen, and this is the male. This is the largest organism in Antarctica, and it is native. It's endemic to this area. Hard to imagine, isn't it, living in an ecosystem that's so basic that this is the biggest thing there. It's a midge, and it's not much more than maybe 4 millimeters long. Now, being native to Antarctica, it needs to be tolerant to a whole range of different conditions. It's got to be very, very, very cold there. It's going to be very, very dry. And this species can tolerate losing 70% of its body water, and it can survive ice freezing in its very body. It's pretty tough. Whereas this species is an alien species that's come from the north. Looks very similar. In fact, it is very similar. It has a suite of pre-adaptations to the same kinds of environments kind of already built into it. So it too can survive a huge loss of water and also survive intracellular freezing. And this is how they've managed to survive so well in an environment where they're not really native. Rocking this PowerPoint display. There we go. Right. So let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. So this is the science bit. So in order to survive somewhere so cold, whether you're an alien species or whether you're a native species, you need to be cold tolerant. And there are 2 ways that you can do that as an organism. either being freeze avoidant or freeze tolerant. Now we, as humans, are freeze avoidant, and if you're me, even though I'm a polar scientist, I'm incredibly freeze avoidant, and you do a hard job to separate me from my tea flask. So we need stuff like this. We have to have big down jackets, we have to have goggles, we have to have hats, we've got enormous boots down there, and I encourage you all to come and have a look, because we're freeze avoidant. We can't deal with these kinds of conditions. So other ways that animals can avoid being frozen is by migrating out of it completely, or by taking completely drastic measures, such as this springtail here. So this is the same guy that we saw back on the slide earlier, native to Antarctica, and what it's done is, in order to avoid being frozen, it's just got rid of the problem. It's got rid of all of the liquid, it's dehydrated itself, flat-packed, vacuum-packed itself, and this is just no longer an issue. It's not a problem. But another strategy is being freeze tolerant, and this is a very, very smart thing to do. So to be freeze tolerant, you need to be able to tolerate the actual processes of ice forming in your cells. Now, if you remember earlier, I think it was Jerry showed a picture of a wilted lettuce leaf. And if any of you have ever tried to freeze a lettuce, if you haven't, don't. It's a really waste of vegetables. But when you pull them out of the freezer, same for bananas, they'll just come out all manky. And this is because of the cell damage. So ice gets inside, it lyses those cells, busts those cells open, and it's just no good. If you want to survive in a cold place, you need to find a strategy to get around that. So one thing that organisms can do is harness lots of different chemicals that drive down the point at which their body freezes, basically like an antifreeze. And what they do is they lower their supercooling point. So this is the point at which any liquid freezes. So typically water might freeze at 0 degrees, but for some animals, they can push it right down so they can survive in really cold areas. So to look at this in a little bit more detail, I'm going to harness the power of a snowflake. No, I'm not. Here I am. Oh my God. I've got a degree, you know. I tried this earlier and it wanted to work for me. But now it's not. Typical. Anyway, okay, so what's happening here is all snowflakes, so every single bit of snow that ever falls from the sky that you ever see, it is formed around a speck of dust. And this is called an ice nucleator. And it doesn't matter if you're ice forming around a speck of dust or ice forming around a bit of food in the gut of an animal, it all needs a nucleator to get itself going. And when this ice forms around nucleators, and if it's inside an organism, it will do damage. So to demonstrate this, I was hoping to have a live demonstration, but unfortunately, I couldn't find any mineral water pure enough because all of the companies that sell water around here lie when they say pure water. But if you have water pure enough and you freeze it to minus 20 degrees Celsius, it will remain liquid until it comes in contact with an ice nucleator. And this is because it is so pure, it has no nucleators in it. And this is what organisms are doing to survive in the Antarctic. They're getting rid of their nucleators in one way or another, either by harnessing chemicals to just move those nucleators out of the way, or just by protecting those nucleators and stopping any ice getting to them in the first place. They're making themselves like pure water. Like I was saying, we just can't do that. Physiologically, we're completely redundant. We are aliens in this world. We're not freeze tolerant. We have to really, really avoid it. We can't even grow our own fur. So let's have a look a bit more about what happens when you do introduce an invasive species into these kinds of ecosystems. So this is the alien midge I introduced to you earlier, Eretmoptera murphyi. It's a catchy name. It's a type of midge, a non-biting midge and a non-flying midge, so frankly, the best kind of midge that you can possibly get in the entire world, and I wish there were more of them in Scotland. So this midge was introduced to Signy Island, just off the Antarctic Peninsula in the 1960s by humans. And the reason that it survived there so well is because it was already pre-adapted to the cold. So when I talked about supercooling points earlier, this guy has got a supercooling point of minus 19 degrees Celsius. So it's really, really used those chaperones and those antifreeze chemicals to be able to survive somewhere really, really cold. It is tough. This is where it set up camp. This is Signy Island. This is the British Antarctic Survey's research base on Signy Island. And Signy is right in the heart of the Southern Ocean, just off the tip of Antarctica, or the Antarctic Peninsula. The sea ice comes right up to the island. And if you were to set sail from Signy Island and go east, You wouldn't hit anything else until you hit Cygne Island coming from the west. It is in the full force of both the Antarctic circumpolar current and the vortex. It's a very extreme place to live. And this is how well the midge is doing. So remember, this is a flightless organism, and it's managed to increase its distribution since the 1960s a great deal. So here is, the X marks the spot, is where it was introduced. And this red area is a survey I did just last year, an area that I found it is now covering of 85,000 meters squared. And what it turns out is we're moving it around on our shoes, in the treads of our boots, without even noticing, just like you probably do every day here. But in Antarctica, this matters because the ecosystem is so basic. So here we have Eretmoptera on the surface and the larvae living underground. And now, since it's been introduced to Cygne Island, it is the only insect on the island. This is now the biggest thing, terrestrially speaking, on the island that occurs. You get some native mites and some native springtails there as well, but nowhere near the levels of abundance that you get with this midge, where you can find it 150,000 of these larvae in a meter squared. Huge numbers. But other than that, you only have a few bacteria and fungi in there as well, and very, very basic vegetation. So this is a very simple ecosystem. But in Antarctic terms, this is effectively a tropical rainforest. Like, something can grow here, that's pretty miraculous in any terms. The thing that characterizes this whole ecosystem altogether is the very, very low soil nutrients levels that you have. So typically in Antarctica, you might find maybe half a microgram a liter of nitrogen levels, a key fertilizer, whereas in maybe your John Innes compost that you have at home, you'd have as much as 300. So tiny, tiny amounts of nutrients. So when you do introduce something that can chew up the peat and do the job of earthworms, like this midge can, in a system that's never had it, this can have a big impact. So what this midge is doing is it's chewing up the peat and the moss and all of the dead organic matter, and it's pooing out baby bio out the back. So to look at this in a little bit more detail, we did some surveys last year. So this is that distribution area I showed you before, and this is the total nitrogen levels that we see from a random selection of surveys. So these dots here are essentially negligible amounts of nitrogen. And what I really want to draw your attention to is this dotted line here, which is the barrier that stops wildlife from moving up these moss banks. So moss is essentially the forest of Antarctica. So when we do find big, huge banks of moss, you do want to try and protect it. And what we found was that when you look at total nitrogen, which you can divide up, so total nitrogen is made of both ammonias and also nitrates and nitrites, with the nitrates being the bit that plants really, really want to suck up as a good fertilizer. And what we found is that when you have Eretmoptera into the system, so this midge, you have quite a decent level of nitrogen compared to areas where you don't have it and where areas where you don't have seals and penguins. What it's not contributing is ammonia, and what it really is contributing out of those total nitrogens is this fertilizing ingredient. It's having a really big impact. What else did the study tell us? Penguins poo a lot, absolutely tons, and most of their poo is made of ammonia. This is not surprising. If you've ever been near any seabird colonies, you'll know how it smells. It absolutely reeks. But with penguins, it's worse because it's pink. What else? No, they don't have a beautiful singing voice. It's just awful. They don't have a singing voice at all. That's a lie. In fact, they sound like this, and I hope this plays for you. 60 of these outside my bedroom window every day. Yeah, that's enough of you. So how do seals actually fit into this story? And it's not their operatics. It turns out that seals are contributing a lot of nitrogen to the ecosystem of Antarctica, primarily through the main fertilizing ingredients of nitrates and nitrites. Great news. So what? Turns out so is the midge. The midge is contributing as much of a fertilizing ingredient as seal colonies are. So this is a tiny insect, effectively, but it's so abundant in the areas where we find it that it can have an impact on the same scale as a mammal. So here we can see it's introducing 3 to 5 times as much nitrogen, and that's primarily made up of the nitrates and nitrites compared to ammonias, which you'd primarily get from penguins. So this is remarkable. This is an organism that we've introduced to such a basic ecosystem. And you guys are the first to see this data as well. I've only just finished going through it. But because this is such an ecosystem influencer, we've started to try and predict how it's going to spread to the Antarctic Peninsula. So essentially, areas that are red are at the highest level of establishment risk, whilst areas that are green are much lower. So unfortunately, there's a lot of red dots, so we're going to need to start considering our biosecurity measures to try and prevent this midge from spreading further. And this is under current climate scenarios. As the planet warms up, what we see is quite interesting when we try and forecast that spread. What we see is that the warmer the color, the more favorable that habitat for the midge to move into. And we find that the only way that the midge is going to go is not to Essex, it's going to go south. It doesn't want to go north, it's going to be too warm for it. Over time, and by the end of the century, it's going to want to be here on the Antarctic Peninsula. So if I was going to summarize anything for you today, it's that humans are an invasive species too. Survival in Antarctica is determined primarily by species cold tolerance. It doesn't matter if you're a midge, whether you're a mammal or even a plant. But we still have to wear big coats because we have no pre-adaptations whatsoever and are very, very freeze-avoidant animals. I want you to know that it's the small things that are going to impact Antarctic ecosystems the most. In fact, not just Antarctic, but any fragile ecosystem. Mountains, the Arctic as well, also desert ecosystems. We can learn a lot about ecosystems and also physiology from these alien species, but in order to study the world, we do also need to visit it, and we have to do that responsibly. So if you want to know anything else, you can find a lot of details, and I'll put this talk also on my website if you want to revisit it. But in the meantime, I'm going to leave you with a small video about the benefits of actually being an alien and getting to visit somewhere as beautiful as Antarctica. It's 7:30 in the morning on I think the 10th of March. And this is the first time we've seen the sun in coming on for 10 days now, I think. This is what it's shown us. It's just stunning. This is Coronation Island. This was a big tabular berg, like a big portion of an ice sheet that's been smashed up in the storms in the last week. This is Robin Peak. This is part of Signy Island. That's Jane. Down there, just coming into view, is base and the stone chute in the background. And sunshine everywhere. I'm here with my flask of tea. The freeze avoidance. Top up on some vitamin D. Amazing. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. Hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you so much to the museum and the festival for inviting me, and for all of these people for keeping me employed. And happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Does anybody in the audience want to kick off our questions? Yes, before we do?
Before we do.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I've got a microphone.
I know, I didn't know where you are. I was just being polite.
Sorry. So the postcards I gave you earlier, so there's 3 postcards that will have stars on them. And I've got some goodies that I need to give away because I just can't carry them back again. So does anybody have a black star on their postcard? Come on down.
Oh, yes. Yes, come on ahead.
I have no idea what size these T-shirts are, but one of them is for you.
This I didn't know we were going to have a raffle. This is very exciting.
So the British Antarctic Survey do like to spread their propaganda.
I just thought it was very pretty.
You're welcome to keep that as well. There we go. Someone else got, there should be 2 in the audience, a black star. Yep.
Yes, one here as well.
You can come down and get it.
Come on ahead.
Yep. And then has somebody got a green star? You've got a green star. Oh, lucky boy. Come on up. So here is a bag. There's a T-shirt in there for you. And there's lots of postcards and lots of information about science, because I know you're a really big science fan.
Put a flag for the red shirt.
There you go. Very much.
Thank you so much.
Now I've distracted you. You'll all ask me nice questions now.
I know, that was purely bribery. I'm devastated now that I didn't get a postcard. I feel like I've been discriminated against.
You can try on the big boots if you like.
Thanks, that'll make it all better. Does anybody want to start a question for Jess? Put your hands up. Do you have a question? Okay, this is your time to shine. Go ahead.
How cold is it in the Antarctic?
So, right in the middle of the Antarctic, it can be as cold as minus 90 degrees Celsius. So that's crazy cold. That's about 3 times as cold as your freezer is. Whereas in the warmest part, so on the outer parts of it, it's just as cold as your freezer 1 time over.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
You had mentioned there biosecurity just at the end of your talk.
Yeah.
What are you guys in this area doing about biosecurity?
Yeah, we're looking into that pretty hard. So a lot of biosecurity in Antarctica has been focused on those tiny microorganisms, so primarily viruses that we might transfer that may harm wildlife. And perhaps as a result, we've been a little bit complacent about the rest of the soil that we might be moving and the bigger things that might be in it. So one thing that we've been doing as part of the research with this midge is looking to see if those chemicals that we use to kill off the viruses and the microorganisms are actually having any effect on the bigger things. It turns out they don't. We need to go back to another strategy to try and think about how we can try and stop this spread and just start to look at it in a little bit more detail. But it's not only the clothes that we're wearing and the boots and the soil that's treading into our boots that are a problem. We also have ships going down there as well. So there's a separate team that's looking at what can be carried on ships, what can stick to the bottom of hulls that we can move across that Antarctic current into Antarctic waters as well.
We have a question there, just David, yeah. Go ahead.
Great talk. I was just sorry. I've seen some of those infographics where they predict where sea levels are going to be if all the ice were to melt, and you know they show you different continents or whatever. And in Antarctica, first of all, I was interested to realize that it's to learn that it's an archipelago, like it's a bunch of islands. I didn't know that before, but they always show it as being green, like if all the ice were to melt, Antarctica would suddenly become green. Is that likely, or would that, like, I know it's a big hypothetical.
Yeah, it is kind of likely. So so Antarctica is just like any icy ecosystem. So it doesn't matter whether it's an Antarctic ice sheet or maybe just a glacier that's retreating. The first things that move in once that ice moves out the way are algae and mosses. So these are your primary kind of plants that move in, and then amongst that you can get some other organisms and basic insects and stuff. And as soon as you introduce any kind of insect, basically anything with a bum that poos is going to be pooing out fertilizer, and that will speed up the process way faster than we can really understand. We're just getting to grips with it now. So you only need that first little step of the ice retreating, and things will green up pretty fast. So typically when an ice retreats, within a couple of decades, you'll start to see greening effects. It might be a little while before that greening is shrubs and trees, but anything that's green is going to photosynthesize, and that'll have a big impact, especially when you've got an area the size of Antarctica. In fact, by the end of the century, it's predicted that an area the size of Wales will be free of ice, and all of that will eventually be photosynthesizing.
See those areas you're saying that are going to be as big as Wales, free of ice? Places like Cygnus Island, those other places that only have very small creatures at present. As it warms up, are creatures going to more naturally gravitate there? Are we going to have to keep introducing them ourselves?
Don't mean to, but yeah.
Yeah.
It will become an increasing, we will start to see more developed ecosystems, not only because, as you hopefully have seen today, you only need to introduce one detritivore, one organism that is going to eat up that dead organic matter and produce some fertilizing ingredients to change the whole chemistry of the soil. You change the chemistry of the soil, and all of a sudden a seed that couldn't germinate there before, maybe now it can. So then we're starting to have this rolling effect. So it's not going to be long before you're going to see much complicated ecosystems. And Signy Island, for sure, it's in the what's called the banana belt of Antarctica, because it's just on the cusp of where the sea ice reaches. So that's going to be one of the first places to change.
Yeah. Do we have another question from the audience for Jess here? There's a question at the very back. Run, David, faster. Question at the very, very back. Go ahead, please. Sorry, would you just hold the microphone a wee bit closer? It's very quiet.
Absolutely, yeah. My question's kind of twofold. One, would you find it a fair assessment to say that the introduction of nitrogen into the soil in Antarctica is a form of terraforming that might be irreversible?
Yeah, I'd say it was, yeah.
How have you found that we have any accurate models as to how this might affect the other species on the planet? Do we have any sort of prognosis, as it were?
So one of the things that I didn't have time to bring up today, but this study was part of a whole ecosystem impact study where I looked at vegetation and also the other native microorganisms and invertebrates. And I found that it is already having an impact. They've only been there for, like 50, 60 years, and we're already seeing huge increases in nitrate levels. We're seeing a decrease in the levels of moss. And this is probably because the moss species that you get in Antarctica, they're adapted to a really low nutrient environment. And they don't tend to do well when you fertilize them. That's more for vascular plants, things that flower or grasses. So we're probably going to see a decline in the mosses, which is a shame because Signy Island has some of the best examples of these Antarctic forests in the whole of the Southern Ocean. But maybe it'll be more beneficial for the rarer vascular plants. So it's a bit of a two-sided coin. But as for longer-term effects, that's definitely something that we can start to model now that we've got this baseline data. This is the first study of its kind in Antarctica that's looking at ecosystem impacts of an alien species. So this is really the beginning of what's going to be a really big iceberg, no pun intended.
Totally intended. Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, if anyone else has one. Raise your hand. Okay, good, because I've got a really good question I've been thinking about during your whole talk. What was your favourite thing that you did the whole time you were in Antarctica? That's a good question.
It's a good
That's
question.
a good question.
So it was actually on Christmas Day. I was in Antarctica for Christmas, and we went up to the top of the ice cap. So Signy Island is essentially a mountain ridge, and it's covered by ice, and there's this huge ice cap that kind of sits over the center of it. And we went to the very top of it on a skidoo, and then we got off a skidoo and got in an expedition pulk, which is basically an enormous sled, and we slid down the ice cap, and it was a mile long toboggan sled, and the whole time you're just sitting there, just like, oh my God, and there's like icebergs in the ocean, and then all of a sudden, like you're coming towards the end of a glacier, and there's some people standing at the end of the glacier just like, no, stop, and it turns out there was a massive drop, kind of about twice the height of this stage, and I was about to fly off the end of it. Thankfully, they caught me, but it was just absolutely hilarious, and then I got off the sled at the bottom, and I climbed down, and I was just crying because it was so funny and it was all so much, you've just gone a mile down a glacier in Antarctica. What? I'm from Cornwall, what? And then I stand up and I'm surrounded by penguins, and it's this huge penguin colony, and it was just one of those moments where I was just, that was it.
That is pretty amazing. I told you that was a good question. You all appreciated that answer. That's fantastic. That's absolutely amazing. Everybody, please give a round of applause to Jess Bartlett. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.